Again, Alex, thank you for your contributions each week. This is my time to talk, and I just want to let you know that it's with kind of great relief that I get to deliver last week's sermon today, because as we all know, last week got all bollocksed up, and I'm pleased that we are together again today, and it's working. So, it was Theodore Parker's discourse on the permanent and transient in Christianity that was on my mind when several weeks ago I offered up today's topic, the permanent and transient in Unitarian Universalism. And during the last few weeks, I have been careening through the thoughts and the writings of others on the permanent and the transient. And as I was in that moment, I recognized the obvious, that Parker's sermon assumed there was permanence. For him, the Word of God is permanent. As I applied the construct of permanent and transient to Unitarian Universalism, it became evident that we don't start with an assumption of permanence. Our religiously liberal tradition has at its heart the concept of continuous revelation, and I know you've heard me talk about that before, but this idea is sometimes understood as a recognition of scientific revelations that distinguish our current world view of the world from those past held views. It is often stated on banners in places like United Church of Christ congregations that read, "God is still talking." So where Parker found the Word of God fixed in the Bible as the permanent part of Christianity, religiously liberal thought has us in an ongoing conversation with God. And as we all know, if you're still talking, things can change. They aren't permanent. So as the whole idea of permanence became less relevant to this conversation, I realized we are now in a significant transient moment in Unitarian Universalism. Our religiously liberal sensibility of faith and religion is transforming into a liberational faith. And today, I'm going to try and make the transformation evident through a look at the primacy of the individual in our current expression of Unitarian Universalism. If I can quickly establish that, then I'll contrast those sensibilities with the priorities of liberational theologies. I'm confident we don't need to denigrate our past nor cast prejudgment on our future, but it is captivating for me to see this process unfolding in Unitarian Universalism today. And it is my hope that in the next few minutes, we're going to be starting a conversation that we'll be having together as long as we're together. To look back for a moment, and I know we've done some of this in earlier sermons, but our religiously liberal faith has its roots stretching back 500 years to the Reformation. We as Unitarians and Universalists are at least cousins to Martin Luther as he expressed his challenges to the Catholic Church in 1517. It has often been said that fundamentally Luther gave us modernity. Among recent biographies, Metaxas's Martin Luther, the man who rediscovered God and changed the world, makes this claim in pretty absolute terms. The quintessentially modern idea of the individual was as unthinkable before Luther as was color in a world of black and white. He continues that, and the more recent ideas of pluralism, religious liberty, self-government, and liberty all entered history through the door that Luther opened. And whether it's useful to figure out an accurate impact of Luther's thought is not important for me today. I just want to recognize that modern religiously liberal thought started with the Reformation, and we traveled forward with the growth of democracy, pluralism, and a broad sense of liberty. And I'm going to take a big historical step forward and recognize that religiously liberal folks had their sense of the priority of the individual reinforced by the transcendental movement in the U.S. in the early 1800s. Our reliance on our individual experience of the divine was hammered into shape by Emerson, Parker, and other leading UUs. It's in Emerson's essay entitled Self-Reliance from 1841, where he explained that the ultimate form of happiness is achieved when a person learns and adopts an individualistic lifestyle. He emphasized, nothing can bring you peace but yourself. Today, I think many of us, most of us at KUUF and across Unitarian Universalism as a whole, our thinking lands somewhere along that individualistic spectrum. And I often hear the idea of pluralism, the sense that there is not one consistent means of approaching truths about the world, that pluralism is being used as a way of reinforcing our prioritization of individual spiritual and religious experience. I'll add that we religious liberals often carry what theologian Harvey Cox termed the sophisticated skepticism of the educated classes. Our religious experience in this modern scientific age has been skeptical to the idea of God in whatever form, and it has tilted heavily toward what we see revealed through science. This is where I want to insert some thoughts on liberation theology and its clear distinction from liberal theology. Liberation theology's starting point is not finding a coherence between religion and science or the intellectual curiosity of faith crises of individual educated believers. It starts with the actual lived experience of oppression and suffering in the world. Cox continued to write that liberation theology begins not with the discovery of unbelief, skepticism, but with the discovery of the absent ones of history, the despised others. Its interlocutor is not the unbeliever, but the hungry person. Not the one who questions God, but the one whose humanity and survival is in question. While European and American theologies look at history through the prism of progress and modernization, or atheism and theism, liberation theologies look at history from its underside, through the prism of oppression and liberation. Liberation theology believes the existence of poverty and oppression demonstrates human relationships without God. Paul Razor, a UU theologian, explained that for liberation theology, the existence of the poor attests to the existence of a godless society, whether one explicitly believes in God or not. The absence of God is present wherever someone is crying out. The absence of God is present in the poor person. The poor are the presence of the absence of God. And he continued, the presence of God is no longer an individual internal emotion, but rather God's presence is a doing. It is the actual practice of one's faith in service of liberation. Over the coming decades, I'm sure there will be plenty of work done to describe a UU sense of God or the divine. Those conversations are already started, and I believe there continues to be room for us all to be part of those conversations. And that's really the part of this transformation that has me captivated watching it unfold. If we shift now slightly from the theological to the justice or social action angle of this discussion, and if we apply the lens of individualism to our religiously liberal approach to what we often call social justice work, we'll generally find that liberals locate the cause of injustice and poverty in social circumstances rather than in the individual or moral failings of people in poverty. The liberal perspective leads to the creation of programs and services for those in need, and really we know that, don't we? We do that all the time. This appears to be a social response. We talk about it in terms of building relationships, right? But at a deeper level, it remains focused primarily on individuals. The idea is that those who are poor can overcome their condition if they have the right education and opportunities. We try to level the playing field and make the system work better for those who have been disadvantaged. Ours is a reform-oriented approach, and it arises out of an ethic of service, I would say, kind of mission work, hands-on social action. Liberationists offer a radical alternative. They see poverty as the inevitable consequence of modern society's economic organization. This perspective focuses on the poor as a class, not on individuals. Poverty is seen as a form of institutionalized violence. Again, Razor writes, by the same token, the oppression of women and people of color is seen in terms of deep-seated structures of patriarchy and racism rather than as a result of personal bigotry. Liberationists address the structural and systemic causes of oppression, and their underlying ethic is not service, but liberation. Razor continues, from the liberation perspective, overcoming these forms of oppression will take more than social programs and goodwill of the middle class. It will take a radical realignment of the social and economic order. I want to be clear. I think we move forward with our acts of service and reform. That is where we live right now. And our transformation from service to liberation will take time. We'll continue to find intersections between liberalism and liberationism when we find systemic responses in which we can engage, and we will choose to engage at that systemic level. We have an example of that opportunity moving through Unitarian Universalism right now. It's known as the eighth principle. Most of you will be familiar with our 7 principles, and we read them at the beginning of the service. Leonard, go ahead and put them up on the screen just so folks can remind themselves of them. These principles were adopted at the 1984 General Assembly, and quite frankly, many people are surprised that they've remained unchanged within a faith founded on continuous revelation for over 35 years. And today, across the country, UU congregations are discussing the adoption of a new 8th principle. And we can change that slide, Leonard. It reads, we, as the member congregations of the Unitarian Universalist Association, covenant to affirm and promote journeying towards spiritual wholeness by working to build a diverse, multicultural, beloved community by our actions that accountably dismantle racism and other oppressions in ourselves and our institutions. A little background on the 8th principle's development. The Reverend Paula Cole-Jones, formerly the Director of Racial and Social Justice for one of the UUA districts, and I'll just not name it because we've now folded the districts into regions, and finding out where it was all before it'd take too much work. But in her work with congregations for over 15 years, she developed the idea of the existence of 2 different paradigms in UU circles. The first, the UU7 principles. And the second, the beloved community, or deep multiculturalism, as she called it. She realized in her work that a person can believe they are being a good UU and following the 7 principles without thinking about or dealing with racism and other oppressions at the systemic level. Her evidence is, again, what we know. Most UU congregations are primarily European American in membership, culture, and leadership. She realized that an 8th principle was needed to help correct this. She talked with Bruce Pollock Johnson about some of the components that should be in it, and Bruce put together the initial draft in 2013, and the two of them worked with a group of anti-racist activists in their district to refine it. Bruce's congregation, the UU Church of the Restoration in Philadelphia, incorporated it into their covenant at that time. Then in May 2017, they formally adopted it, and they recommended that the UUA adopt it as well. So the eighth principle came from a feeling that we need something to renew our commitment to the work of confronting racism at a systemic level and to hold ourselves accountable and to fulfill the potential of our existing principles. I want to note for you all that our draft covenant that is available for you to review online at KEWANAUU.org and that we'll be voting on at the June membership meeting, that draft covenant includes a section in which our aspirations for living together in our fellowship are stated in ways that clearly support the intentions of the eighth principle. So in a few minutes here, we've had a broad historical sweep of our religiously liberal heritage and included a brief introduction to the equally broad thought of liberation theology, and then focused on an action of our Unitarian Universalist Association in consideration of an eighth principle, and then even more locally, our own proposed covenant. I feel we are marvelously entwined with others in reshaping Unitarian Universalism and living out our faith through our actions. I look forward in the coming weeks to getting together on Zoom to discuss the eighth principle. Let's see where this takes us, and let's get there together with UUs across the country. Thank you. A song from Alex, please.